Welcome to the Nephology podcast. I'm your host, Joe David, and I'm the founder and CEO of Nephos Group. On this podcast, we talk to founders, innovators, disruptors, and entrepreneurs from all across the globe who are building in Web3, technology, and finance. And if that's something that you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss out on any of the latest episodes. Now on to the next episode. Welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Nephology podcast. We've got a slightly different format to what we would normally have today. So normally, I'm kind of sat one-on-one or one-on-two chatting to people, but I'm going to flip slightly and be in the kind of listener speech or whatever you want to call it, these days, where I'm going to be joining a panel. So we've got a very good panel here, and I'm going to hand over to Lucas as our head of BD to introduce everyone and to frame this conversation.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Joe. And thank you, Harry and Alex, our guests who have joined us today. Like Joe mentioned, I'm head of business development at Nephos. Today, we're going to be focused on esports. So it's going to be a super interesting chat. Let me start by handing over to Harry from Mishcon to Reya for an introduction.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Lucas. So I'm Harry. I'm an associate in the interactive entertainment team at the UK law firm Mishcon to Reya. As the name implies, we kind of operate for a really broad range of players in the sort of interactive entertainment sector. So on the esports side, organizations, tournament organizers, service providers to the industry, and then a sort of broader remit of games publishers, developers, even some sort of gambling operators as well. So yeah, really excited to be here today. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you, Harry. I'll hand over to Alex next for your intro.
Cheers, Lucas. My name is Alex. I run a company called NIVO Management, which is basically works across entertainment and mostly in esports and across some other things as well. My kind of role is being the head of talent commercial, so I work a lot across kind of representing professional esports players and doing their kind of contract negotiations, finding them new teams, new homes, and helping them find also, new locations to kind of move to. And yeah, on the commercial side of things, I do some sponsorship related things with them as well, and just kind of help them build their brands and kind of help them guide their careers as they go through, just like as a regular football agent would, but just in a completely new, different industry.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. And Joe, I'll hand over to you. There might be some new viewers who don't know who you are, so over to you, mate.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, so I'm Joe. I'm the founder and CEO of Nephos. We're a professional services group supporting entrepreneurs, founders with their accounting, tax, global structuring, and anything in between. So the only area we really try and avoid is the legal area. So
wise choice, yeah.
But everything else from a professional services perspective, we do touch on in some way. So yeah.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, look, thank you all for joining today. I guess we've got a few different, topics that we're going to cover today. We'll start off, with Harry in terms of setting the scene in terms of esports versus traditional sports. We'll then dive into sort of what role, professional services play within the space from, accounting, legal point of view, accounting point of view, and talent management point of view. Before diving into, how we negotiate deals in the talent management space. And then, we'll wrap up by looking at trends in esports later on. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Harry to set the scene.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Lucas. And it sounds like a start of a bad joke, doesn't it? Like a lawyer and accountant and an agent walking into a room.
Sounds like a very bad joke.
But no, look, so, as I said, I kind of work across the interactive entertainment sector, and I know that there'll be plenty of people kind of listening to this who are like well embedded in either esports or games or kind of entertainment more broadly, and they'll listen to this section and probably roll their eyes. But for people who are sort of non-endemics or are kind of new to this space, and especially because in my experience, I think kind of legal issues as they relate to these sectors are coming to the fore in the sort of consumer's mind a lot more in recent years and months. I think it's helpful just to start with a kind of basic overview of how esports sort of sits in this sort of strange grey legal economic area between the sort of traditional games sector and sports. I think at one extreme with the sort of traditional games sector, the whole premise of that industry is traditionally a publisher and a developer get together, they create a game, they create a product, and their business model is centered around controlling and monetizing that IP. They have a great degree of control as to how that product is commercialized, shared, re-commercialized, how they involve third parties, and that's kind of their bread and butter business model, right? And then at the other end, you've got the sports model where no single person or entity owns the concept of a sport. No one owns football, no one owns basketball, but you have leagues and associations that are kind of set up to put on and facilitate instances of that sport. Right, so give you an example, no one owns the sport of basketball, but the NBA owns the rights to its league and will have kind of agreements in place with its players regarding their own associations and affiliations and so forth. And to me, esports is a really interesting kind of middle ground because it's this whole sector that is built upon the sort of creation and the IP and the products that are created by a publisher, but you've got all these other third parties getting involved, the teams and the organizations, the tournament organizers that are trying to commercialize that product and IP in some way, right? And the sort of short story answer to that is that you can have a really diverse range of different ways in which esports is commercialized and a lot of sort of centralized control from the publisher's perspective in terms of how they want that to happen. And it makes for some quite interesting dynamics, as I'm sure we'll come on to, as to how agreements kind of play out in this space and kind of, the workarounds that the organizations and other kind of stakeholders have to be mindful of when they're trying to kind of build businesses.
Just a quick question on that. They wouldn't say no, because why would they? But do you have to get, for example, like for the Esports World Cup that's going on right now, do you have to get Call of Duty's permission, for example, to have that game at the Esports World Cup? Like, can people just play it commercially, or do they have to get the rights of? Because, like you say, football they can just play. No one can stop you playing football.
Yeah.
And monetizing that. Can they stop you playing Call of Duty? Why they would, I don't know, because obviously there's brand awareness and all that sort of stuff.
For sure, that's exactly kind of what I was going to lead on to, right? There's a difference in the no, that's a good segue. Like, there's a difference in the answer between what they could theoretically do and what in practice they do, right? So, in theory, a publisher has a great degree, or any kind of rights holder of an IP has a great degree of control over how their stuff gets shared and redistributed, right? Let's plays on YouTube and live streams are technically instances of their works kind of being copied and redistributed in that way. But as you sort of hinted at, they don't do that because they recognize that there's a marketing arm to this, there's a commercial arm to this. We're getting people talking about the game. Things like sort of commercial enterprises of people running competition structures, I'd say that most publishers tend to have some sort of public-facing guidelines that sort of say, if you do things up to X level, a certain amount of revenue or this sort of size or this sort of structure, we're fine with it. But if you go above and beyond that, or you're in some cases looking to do it at commercial scale to any degree, then we want you to have a license with us and we want you to have your permission first. And
want to get paid.
And get some money for it, right? So, it's the classic legal phrase of it depends, but like each publisher genuinely has its own sort of approach to doing this, and that's kind of one of the interesting quirks of the industry is that there's just no standardization at all, which is what I'm sure we'll come on to as well. But
I wanted to add on that, like it depends again, as kind of Harry said, what the publisher is, because like Nintendo, for example, anything from what I've seen and what I heard, like even if you host a 100-pound tournament, you need their approval on everything. They're very, they want to keep everything internal compared to like, Call of Duty, for example, will be, if you're hosting a, 1,000-pound event, you probably won't need their licensing or their approval to do something like this. But as Harry said, like depending on the scale, Esports World Cup, I think, the total is 27 million, but I think Call of Duty specifically is around the 1 million or 2 million mark.
Into the prize money.
Into the prize money. So when it becomes obviously on that kind of scale, then I think
they want that cut.
Exactly.
Yeah,
they want to be involved as fast as possible on that end.
Yeah, I think everyone wants their cut. I mean, certainly from a taxation point of view.
They want that cut.
Yeah, for the winners as well. But look, I think that's great, and I'm glad that the World Cup, has been mentioned as well because it's so timely. So why don't we go on from that? I guess from an agent's perspective, what role do agents play within the esports space, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned kind of earlier, you think, why do these guys need agents? Like, obviously in football, any other sport, basketball, anything, almost every athlete has an agent. And, some of those people get scouted when they're 11, 12. Like, I know people that are, in F3, and before that they were karting and they already had agents at the age of 12. It's kind of, it's a completely different world there. And it's very normalized compared to in esports. Agencies only came into effect like not too long ago. It was one where it was just kind of a lot of cowboys running around, and it was friends that were just like acting as agents, and then no one knew what they were doing, let's just say that. And now it's getting a bit more professionalized, and there's more professionalism involved, and that's kind of our goal at NIVO Management, is to bring in kind of professionalism into that side of things, to be able to show that we're actually people that understand the market. And that's the reason how like we entered it, because we saw that there's so many people that are in the market already involved as esports agents, but no one actually knew anything except how much can I say what the salary is and what are your bonuses, and that's it. And that's what people usually do when it comes to contracts, at least from the agency perspective. But in general, the role, again, as I said, it's kind of as a football agent would do. I would look for, I would find a player. Sometimes I do the scouting myself. I'll go to events and I watch people play, or I watch them play online, and I see the potential in them.
Yes.
And then, once I pick them up as an individual, I have to kind of pitch myself to them and be able to bring them on board. Once I do that, it comes, the next kind of stage comes in is, do I find them a team? Where do they want to go? Obviously, depending where they live. I have clients kind of living in America, in Europe, in the UK, in South Korea, all over the world. So, you need to have a good network of individuals to kind of be able to find them a new home. Once you find a new home, obviously you do their kind of basic negotiations, you work on their contract, obviously more from a commercial perspective. Obviously we still look, making sure that the player is safe from the kind of termination side of things, and to make sure that, when people usually say, oh, this is a 2-year contract, but they have a 1-month termination notice, I count it as a 1-month contract. This is not a 2-year contract, I'm sorry. But, they love to kind of, be a bit sneaky. And I feel like the esports organizations, which obviously are the teams that, I'm negotiating across, are still quite new. There's some teams that have in-house legal teams, and there's a lot of them. Some of them actually use outside counsel as well. So sometimes you do actually have to deal with lawyers on the other side of things. But obviously,
sorry about that.
Yeah. But at the same time, like, we can obviously provide legal advice. So, and we have kind of players all over the world. So if we do need actual legal advice, we kind of seek out. We have a connection of lawyers from each different country, depending where the contract is kind of based. So once you found that team, obviously what now? Usually most agents in the kind of market, once that's done, they just kind of clean up their hands and say, oh, time to collect my paychecks. I'll speak to you in 2 years. And you kind of, just sit back and relax. But from our end, our kind of goal is like, okay, once we've done that, that's 70% of the work. What now? We look to kind of develop, first of all, their brand. So we bring editors on board to work on their TikTok, be able to kind of take all their kind of live streams and all their kind of highlights and gameplay and turn that into like a brand side of things. We even had we had a couple players where we created walkouts for them, which is like celebrations and stuff, which is quite unique, And then the third thing is we think, how else can we develop these guys? Because, a lot of these players came from just playing indoors. They never, in sports, for example, you start at academy at the age of 10 and you work your way up, you learn a lot of different skills through that. But these guys, they came in just playing at home, sitting at home, not really leaving the house, and don't have a lot of the same skills and just don't know what the real world kind of looks like. So we kind of try to manage them and help them with their careers on that end. So, I had one guy that was moving to Germany to go play, and I had to find him an apartment. I found them a mattress place to buy a mattress, funny enough. I found them, we have some people that need therapists. We have some people that want the kind of nutrition work. So kind of it all depends on each player, but we're trying to kind of bring that standard of like sports agency into the kind of esports side of things, because I feel like there's a lot to learn from the sports side of things, and I feel like also sports has a lot to learn from esports.
Indeed.
But we kind of try to do that, and we always try to do new things. Once we try to do a kind of 10-week module with nutritionists that work in Formula 1, because actually, funny enough, I see esports quite heavily almost the same as F1 drivers, not in the same of risking their lives every single day, but in the same kind of like they need to be locked in and focused for a short amount or like a decent amount of time. And we brought a F1 nutritionist to kind of do a course on like jet lag, nutrition, hydration, and kind of a lot of those things where they never even thought about that. Like those guys are waking up, they pop a Red Bull 5 minutes before practice, and their days last anywhere from 12 to 14 hours. So, it's kind of, trying to, as I said, like to kind of wrap it up, is trying to bring that professional side of things and trying to bring that into esports is a big goal for us, but also at the same time, helping these kids manage their kind of careers and be able to help them out across basically their journey from the start to end.
Fantastic. Yeah, look, I think that's great, and I think there's certainly, a lot of parallels, as you've mentioned, with sort of professional sports in terms of, helping guide people both, through that career, through that success, and also post career, post success as well. We see the same when it comes to sort of financial management as well. So Joe, I'm not sure whether you want to dive into that sort of view from an accounting standpoint.
I'll speak quickly. First of all, I wanted to say that the F1 comparison I think is a really good comparison because a lot of sports are central to the location, right? So football, they play in England. They have some European games, but they play in England. The NBA, they play in America. F1's probably one of those main sports where they are for the season. They are traveling everywhere, right? So they do have to manage things like jet lag and being in different time zones and climates, and so that's probably a really
it was quite interesting. We learned a lot. The best advice that everyone got, which is funny what they learned, is bring your own pillow. Funny enough, and that's what apparently almost every F1 driver does. Bring your own pillow because you can make it seem like you're sleeping at home. And it was funny to
simple
hear that,
advice that actually makes a difference.
Exactly, but some of these guys are traveling like, if you're playing Counter-Strike, you could be not at home for about 200 something days.
And I know you asked me, Lucas, sorry, to talk about. I'm not going to be a very good guest, but why can't they just play in their bedroom? Why do they have to travel to I guess is there rules around how they're playing and are they cheating and stuff like that? Maybe? I don't know, but why can't they just, given it's online? Why do they have to travel to the location?
Well, some of them are online, so there's kind of different approaches to esports. There's a franchise system, so thinking kind of like a Premier League where you have your, let's say, 12 clubs, 12 orgs. They, let's say, for example, in a game called Valorant, there's 4 across the world. One's in Berlin for the European market. There's one in Los Angeles for Americans. There's one in South Korea and Seoul, and there's one in China. So that's one of those where they come there every single week.
On location,
play there in a studio with like fans and kind of do that for like 6-7 weeks. And then they'd be able to kind of go to international event after. But a lot of the kind of lower tiers, which is like the tier 2, 3, they all play online, and they do have kind of like, there's a lot of cheating allegations in esports, let me tell you that, and we've seen that. It's a bit better now, but
that's why I mentioned that, because I can imagine if you're on your own, there is an element of, I'm not sure how, because I don't play, but like there's an element that you could, I guess if you're playing those top tier,
a lot of
with
people,
big prize money, you need to cover off every base, I guess. Thank you. So I guess going back to the actual question you asked me about the financial side. So, I think the main thing as well here is, you look at sports, traditional sports, and they've been around for a very long time in most cases, and therefore the structure for how the players are paid, or for how the sponsorship is kind of framed, and all those sorts of things. They've been around for a long time. And quite often the clubs, depending on the sport, obviously have been around for a long time as well. So they've got a lot of history. They've got a lot of, and again, depending on the sport, the money in the sport. So take football, even the NBA and the NFL. The money in those sports is so big that these clubs have in-house accounting. They have in-house financial support. All those sorts of different things. So I think for those sports, it is simpler. Even some of the smaller football clubs will have their own in-house accounting teams, and they can support some players on bits and pieces. But in esports, all of this is new, right, to an extent. So a lot of the clubs or the teams are learning. Obviously, the players are learning. That, again, we talk about cross-jurisdiction. In football, they typically play and work in England, for example. In esports, they could work and earn in lots of different jurisdictions, same in like, say, Formula 1 and things like that. So that managing that around cross-jurisdiction, where they've earned their money, where are they tax resident, so where should they be paying their tax? They might be a British citizen, but actually they spend most of their year in Berlin, for example, playing tournaments. Therefore, are they now a German tax resident, and how do they manage that? But then also from the team's perspective, they need to consider, do they need to pay tax on behalf of withhold any tax or what have you. So getting that structure right is important, and managing between, I imagine in the esports, a lot of them start off as maybe contracting, and then maybe they could move into employment. But obviously from a contractual perspective, there'll be fixed term contracts, I guess, like there are in other sports. With a 1 month notice. I mean, I imagine a lot of football and a lot of football teams would love a 1 month notice on some of their players. Man United would right now, I can tell you that. So I think that's really important, is understanding the legal terms of the contract, which will then determine the kind of accounting and tax treatment off the back of that.
Yeah, fantastic. And look, that's a great segue to go to Harry for, any, I guess, considerations from your side.
Yeah, I mean, it's something our employment colleagues kind of grapple with and have done in the esports space. So that sort of employee-contractor difference and the implications for the teams and the players themselves. I mean, I think generally speaking, each jurisdiction will obviously have its own set of rules, but there's a few sort of shared concepts that generally apply to a lot of them, and they tend to relate to issues like to what extent does the prospective employer have control over what the supposed employee does with regards to being on site in certain locations, and whether or not they're free to contract and do things with other parties for kind of related work. Is there a kind of an essence of financial risk on the part of the individual worker? Are they entering into a tournament to potentially win a prize, and there's no guarantee that they necessarily get paid for that work, versus a quote unquote employee who has a rolling salary and has more of a financial guarantee in that sense. And as you were saying, Joe, it's a really important consideration from a tax perspective, legal perspective, and a practical side of things as well. This isn't just a sort of theoretical issue as it relates to esports and entertainment more generally. I think the most high profile example I can think of recently was Mr. Beast, and it was producing Beast games, and he's now kind of in for a massive lawsuit that's going on with a whole bunch of his production staff, because they were alleging that they should have been treated and classified as employees and been subject to all sorts of statutory rights that they weren't, or allegedly weren't, because they were deemed to be contractors.
And there's some big outside esports, even things like Uber, for example. Uber in London went through a huge, probably did in the US as well, but went through a huge legal case around the legality of it. So it's not just esports, is it? So you think they would have been able to learn from some of these other...
It's everywhere, but esports is kind of somewhat uniquely exposed to it, I think, because, like the rosters, the players that, that will compete, will come and go for given seasons and for given games. There might be sort of more semi-permanent staff behind the scenes that are doing a marketing production, but, it's really quite a sort of case-by-case analysis that you have to do. And if you're the sort of prospective employer, and you kind of want to be mindful of not, going under that sort of employee status, you would probably look to kind of try and do all of your sort of payments on a sort of deliverables basis. So, you're going to do this set project with me for this, I'm going to end up with this end result, and you'll get paid on that basis, rather than something like, come work with me for 90 days, I'm going to give you a wide range of tasks, and at the end of it, you'll kind of get paid on a time basis or a day rate rather than something else. So, yeah, definitely a recurring issue that happens in the space.
And do you guys have a battle, like, not you guys specifically, but like from an agency perspective and a lawyer perspective, what you might want as an agent versus what and a lawyer, I'm not saying they're against you, they're on your side, well, they're trying to help, they're trying to do the best, but actually because a fixed term contract with set payments every month with no get out clause is much safer in inverted commas than a kind of rolling contractual basis. But from your perspective, you might, do you see what I mean? Like there's a difference between the legalities of it and the agency. So do you have that battle sometimes where you're both trying to get the right outcome for the client, but actually what you want is slightly different?
I mean, I think for the players, it's always worth to be an employee in general, because you get so many more benefits. For example, for my guys that are living in Germany, they're all employees there because they have to be employees. There's no other way around it, and they get health benefits. They can go to doctors. Like they have everything. Obviously, they get taxed quite heavily in Germany, which is almost 50% a month. Wow. It's quite a lot. But in general, it's most of the time it's better to have an employment contract, at least for the players. It's more because sometimes even if you do have a 1 month termination in the contract, the German, for example, employment regulations can come in and they can kind of switch it around and make it that, because you couldn't get like tossed out to the side of the street like unfairly, right? So they kind of, you have another level that you can kind of go to, but when you're a independent contractor, you can't really do anything. Once it's done, it's done. You have nothing to kind of back you up, at least from our kind of side of things.
Maybe I'm too optimistic, and I don't think it shouldn't always be that adversarial, right? I think it's good on the part of an employer to know the status of their employees, and hopefully there's a sort of transparency and a kind of clarity between the two parties that they're on the same page with something. Because if it goes wrong, like that Mr. Beast example, it can blow up in your face reputationally and can cause you a lot of economic damage as well, right? So I tend to see kind of more of some of the more tensions arise in the sort of branding space, things like kind of influencer agreements and kind of sponsorships and that kind of thing. Definitely been instances where I'm sure everyone can think of high profile examples off the top of their head that streamer or a content creator, an influencer kind of goes off the rails and brings a brand into deep water, right? And they kind of have to deal with it. I think it's usually some kind of reputational kind of issue at hand that can drive some of those decisions as much of the time as much as the sort of the black letter law stuff.
Yeah, that's great. And look, I mean, this is a perfect segue into, I guess, negotiating a brand deal. So I'm not sure, maybe if we start with Alex for this question, sure. If you can sort of take us through the key steps into negotiating a brand deal. I guess one of the things that we've spoken about so far has been, prize money and earnings, and how sort of players are paid in that regard. But another key revenue stream is going to be the brand deal. So
this is definitely where they fight.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm determined to get these.
Especially because you've got someone negotiating in the best interest of the team and someone who might not be.
Yeah. From our end, kind of players in general try not to, they do some brand work. Obviously, I used to work with influencers as well, but players in general are quite they can't really do as much as they can, for example, in sports just in general, because a lot of the teams have sponsorships. So, there's kind of like a massive blacklist, which I'm sure you probably wrote one of them before, that says you're not allowed to do sponsors. And it goes from all the way from A to Z, covers everything from, from crypto to gambling to your favorite energy drink. But in general, the stuff that we look at when it comes to the brand side of things is making sure, obviously, how long can they use their IP for and what's the actual usage of it. The biggest one that I always kind of see, at least in kind of, especially in player contracts, is can the player, if the organization is sponsored by, let's say a Red Bull, they can say that this player loves Red Bull and sports Red Bull, but he has to say this player that plays for this organization, uses or drinks Red Bull, for example. So you have to make sure that you're using the kind of the language and the contracts correctly. But when it comes for actual influencers, again, obviously the IP, the usage, how long they can have that for, and the main thing for us is the kind of obviously the deliverables and the longevity of it. We're not looking to do, a lot of influencers and a lot of people in that space look to do fast, quick money deals, like 1 month or like one, little stream, and that's it, like 2-hour stream, and you kind of get a payout, and that's it. For us, it's more about, okay, can we do actually a long-term partnership rather than, focusing on the short-term side of things, and kind of even willing to do some trials, some testing, and we've done that before. Like we had an example where trying to bridge the gap between always gaming and kind of just regular media or regular, just entire world. So we had one individual who plays a game called Rocket League, which is just a 3 versus 3. You drive cars. It's basically football, but with cars. There you go. And we worked with Samsung on that and ended up getting it streamed on the Piccadilly Circus on the big screen. And then like their kind of event, which kind of, brought all the eyes and attention and actually was very successful on that end. But at the same time, we couldn't turn that into like a longer deal, but it was fine because for us it was more about getting that out to the kind of the main media and kind of showing people what can you really do with esports. But to kind of summarize, I guess it's about the IP. It's making sure that you have a cap on how long you can use that, and also working on not just a 1 month contract basically, but it's working about for deliverables and always trying to turn it into 1 year, monthly deliverables to make it sure that it also matches the influencers or the person's kind of brand. Because there's a lot of times where people come to them and say, we'll pay you 50 grand to promote a gambling thing, and the individual could be not interested in gambling whatsoever, and he knows his fans are 16 years old, 15 years old, so it doesn't make sense for him to do that. And we always try to stir them away from that kind of stuff because it's so easy to damage your reputation, and once your reputation is damaged, it's very, very hard to come back as an influencer and making sure that you kind of back and your fans kind of believe in you again.
Indeed. That's great. And Harry, I guess from the legal perspective, anything you'd add there?
Yeah, I mean, so I've previously had experience working in-house on the sort of more brand side of those kind of deals, and the easy cop-out answer is you say the opposite to what someone on the other side said, but actually in practice it doesn't really work like that. So I think there's probably kind of like an order of priorities from a brand side of things as to what matters most to them, and there's actually going to be a lot of kind of mutual areas, like especially on things like deliverables, like what are we actually agreeing to do here. That's really important to kind of whittle down in detail. To give you an example, like you've just got a contract which says that the talent will post on Instagram 12 times in the year, and that's all it says. Then there's a lot of ambiguity there as to what it's going to look like, right? Are they going to post on their story? Are they going to post on their main account? Are they going to post it all in 1 week? They're going to do it over the course of a year. So it's the kind of finer, more dry details like that are actually really important from the brand side of things. They want to know what they're getting and when, and they want to bake it into their own sort of content schedules and that sort of thing. We kind of hinted at it there with sort of like brand guidelines and IP that applies on the brand side as well. They want to make sure that, if we're giving the talent a license to use our trademarks and our logos, that they're doing it in the right way. Maybe, especially if they're using other third parties' IP as part of those posts and that content creation, that they're doing it in a way that they, the brand, have agreed with that other party as well. So there's a lot of sort of guidance that will go to the other side on that. Some of the kind of more material issues tend to relate to things like indemnities and a right to terminate on the brand side, especially if the influencer or the talent starts kind of going a bit crazy and off the rails. If it all, especially in kind of today's market, all you need is like one news story to kind of sweep up a piece of talent tweet. And the wrong tweet or a cheating allegation, whatever it is, and it's not just the talent that gets brought into disrepute, it's all the sponsorships and everything associated around them, right? So there's usually some kind of wording, whether it's a termination right or something like an indemnity. If the talent goes off and starts using other people's IP without your permission, it's like, you're going to indemnify us, the brand, you're going to promise to pay us for any kind of legal costs associated with that fallout. So I think that's kind of the sort of more kind of the key issues that get negotiated from the brand side.
Fantastic.
I think there was a case with Cristiano, or not case as in not a legal case, because he wants to sue Cristiano Ronaldo. But I think it might have been the Qatar World Cup or something like that, where there was a Coke sponsorship, and he refused to he was supposed to have Coke in front of him at the press conference, and he refused and would only put water there because he was like, it's unhealthy, and it was something like that.
It was in a press interview, and I think he moved a soft drink. It was either Coke or Pepsi aside and said only aqua, only water. I think that ended up shaving off I think $2 billion in the sort of this capitalization of the stock because it's publicly traded.
That Coke went to Cristiano Ronaldo.
Maybe that's. I don't know what was at play there from a legal side if he was under an obligation to show
but the point is, sometimes
a
talent can do. Do you know what that does? I don't agree with the particular. I remember Conor McGregor as well in the UFC, when he brought his whiskey out. Every UFC event he was on was his whiskey.
For sure.
And then there was Khabib, who's the Russian, and I think he's Muslim as well. And he was like, he doesn't obviously drink, and so he was like, well, I don't, and they obviously hated each other anyway. So there is this kind of I guess, real battle between, especially when they're I've just chosen two of the biggest names in their particular sports, but a real battle, I guess, when it's that big name talent versus a big name brand, and how they, because neither of them want to fight in that. When it's Coke and Ronaldo, neither of those really want, because the only people, no offense, that win in that is a lawyer, right? What they really want is to work together. So I guess sometimes there's negotiation. It's not just a case of enforcing the contract. Sometimes I guess there's
absolutely, there's bargaining power on both sides, right? If you've got a massive brand and a relatively small time streamer, then you're going to be hard pushed to kind of get much past them, and it's going to be a take it or leave it approach. But vice versa, if you've got an up and coming brand that somehow secures a deal with a major multinational athlete, then they're going to have to just kind of jump at the opportunity to work with them, right? So that kind of speaks the sort of hidden bargaining power, negotiating power that goes on behind the scenes when these agreements get drawn up, and also the draw that these influencers and the talent have nowadays. I've seen crazy statistics that Gen Z and below and sort of generational demographics increasingly just rely upon influencers and individuals online to inform their purchasing decisions. And so Ronaldo moving a soft drink or whoever can have a major impact on purchasing power and consumer spending, right? So that's why
diabetes,
it's so
right?
that's it.
I guess, sorry, Lucas, to keep being the questioner here, but I guess that then leads a point to brands and the athletes then also prioritizing, kind of what they're choosing and what they're, obviously Formula One as an example used to be smothered with cigarettes, back in the day, right? And then obviously they had to start removing that, and then gambling was a huge thing, obviously, in football, but now you see gambling coming out in crypto. A lot of the gambling companies have been replaced by crypto companies on a lot of these, football clubs and their shirts and, stuff like that. So I guess it's also trying to get the right brands to fit with the right people, right? To get that the right mix of audience, because like you said, if my audience is solely younger children, so my son's age, for example, 10 years old, and that's all that he's viewing, there's no point in advertising cigarettes, for example, because he can't smoke. Bad example, I know, but whereas you want to advertise stuff that is in his so that do you know what I mean? It's because otherwise it's not
Yeah.
worth it either. So you've got to fit the right talent with the right brand, I
Absolutely,
guess.
yeah. It has to be like endemic. I mean, Crypto.com got involved in esports and did a deal with Fnatic, which
Okay.
is a UK actually esports.
They're one of the
organization.
biggest, aren't they?
Yeah, they're one of the kind of big dogs in the industry, which they paid, I think, was it something crazy, like 15 million over like 3 years. And during that time, that's when it was kind of like the hot boom of kind of a lot of people just want to get involved. But yeah, we see a lot of that space, and I think also in kind of esports it's about the endemic brands, like, and we're seeing a bigger push now, as you were mentioning, like in sports, like Ronaldo could be sponsored by Coca-Cola, for example, but then his team could be sponsored by Pepsi, and that's okay. But in esports, that is a big no-no. Like it's quite hard for players to have individual sponsors that contradict with a professional.
Why is that
esports.
okay? Because Ronaldo's so big, he can do what he wants. Or
No,
because...
I think in football, I think it's okay because they know how to kind of distinct the two, and there's different avenues to get money as a sports team. But esports teams rely heavily on sponsorships. So when when you want to have a player that wants to be on a Red Bull athlete, for example, but the team is sponsored by Monster, it becomes a big contradicting point for them, where let's say on his streams he can only drink Monster, but when he's playing the game on stage he has to drink the Red Bull. So it's a hard tiptoeing kind of issue at the moment, and we're seeing more and more of them. Actually, there's like 5 players or about 6 players that have their own mouse sponsors now, for example, but the team is sponsored by a different peripheral company.
And I guess
So
that
we're
does
seeing
make
a big
sense.
movement, yeah.
Because traditional sports, you get other revenue streams, like you say, like
Exactly.
gate receipts and
Yeah.
maybe concessions within the stadium. They might get confessions in the stadium as well. But things like that. I guess whereas in esports, you probably don't get.
You rely heavily on sponsorship money and prize money. If your team's not performing, you're left to sponsorship money, and then if you don't have sponsors,
if you're not
that's
performing,
it.
you
You're
don't get
minus
sponsors.
2. Every year you're in the minuses. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Fantastic. Look, I think, before we wrap up, it'd be good to think a little bit about the future. So what I might do is call out a couple of topics for each one of you, and then hear your feedback on that. So I'll start with Alex again. I should be doing around the circle, but I'm almost going in alphabetical order. So Alex, in terms of trends for the future, I think let's have a look at where we've just come out of. Post-COVID, there was a bit of a, I guess during COVID, there was a bit of a bubble. Post-COVID, there was a so-called esports winter. What's next?
What's next? Yeah, I mean, that time alone was, it was a tough one. I mean, obviously we had, the sports weren't happening, anything was happening. Everyone could still play online at home and be able to kind of work to that. And then everything got inflated, like people's salaries were ridiculous, like especially in America, like the numbers there were just insane, and now everything's just aligning and kind of getting itself to a good point. I think the future, I think it's on a good trajectory. I think we have a couple more years of kind of balancing out to see where things will go. Because some, as I mentioned, due to the lack of sponsorships to some teams and teams not be able to make money, a lot of people are making cuts at the moment. So I think we're still not through the kind of the full downfall of that. So hopefully once we kind of reach that, whatever comes down has to come up. So hopefully once we reach that, we'll be able to kind of go back up and kind of continue building out this kind of industry, because it's a very exciting industry. Obviously, like we have the Esports World Cup going on, we have the Olympics for esports coming out, which is, if you think about it, no one would even think about that 10 years ago. People would laugh at that opportunity. So we have that we're always trying to bridge that gap of, whatever esports and sports is, and kind of be able to bring that to the mainstream. And I'm thinking, once, let's say me and Harry have kids, and our kids will grow up watching. Sorry, not me and you specifically. I was like, cut that one out. They'll, the stuff they'll be watching, I think, will be more esports related. There's going to be so many more things happening, and I know I'm thinking much into the future, but it's going to continue growing, continue developing, and then honestly, I think it's going to be something amazing down the line.
Indeed, that's fantastic. And then I guess, like Harry, at the beginning of the podcast, you sort of framed it with a lot of comparisons to regular sports.
Sure.
How do you see that continuing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, just to bring it full circle, I mean, I know I said at the outset that esports has its distinctions from the games industry, for example, but ultimately that's the esports industry is reliant on the game sector thriving in order to kind of help support it and give it a base. And in my view, to keep it fresh and to keep it exciting, right? I think if you look at the vast majority of the most viewed and most played current sort of esports competitive titles, they're all like 5-10 years old. Not to say that it can't continue forever, but I think it's the introduction of new experiences, new games, exciting new themes and structures that kind of keep people engaged. And it's part of the issue that's going on in the games industry right now, is that it's increasingly hard from a discoverability perspective to get your game out there, to get eyeballs on it. The sort of initial release of a game is arguably more important than ever in terms of attracting and retaining a player base, and that has a significant impact in terms of trying to do the same from the sort of esports and the marketing arm of that release, right? If the game releases and within 2 months the player base has dropped substantially because they can't support it, there's issues with the release, they just can't get enough kind of word of mouth out there, then you're really going to struggle to kind of build a competitive scene on top of that. And so I think publishers and developers are kind of struggling with the dynamic of, we want to make sure that the game is good on release, we want to make sure it's commercially viable, and in an ideal world we want to perhaps build a really kind of sustained competitive scene around it. But they're grappling with higher budgets, increased difficulties with discoverability, the pace at which consumer kind of habits are changing, not just within games, but like the attention economy more broadly. People are kind of bouncing all over the place in terms of their interests now with various forms of media and adaptations and so forth. All that to say, which means I think breaking out and making a sort of long-lasting, sustained, competitive title is getting increasingly difficult, because the incumbents have been there for so long, and to get the scale that you need in order to make it sustainable is so great that it's a tall order. So I'm a bit like kind of the so-called esports winter and the bubble that happened during COVID. There's definitely parallels that kind of happen in the game space there, and I think, as Alex was hinting at, we're hopefully going to kind of see a bit of a maturity and a settling out and a return to expectations in that sense in that sector. And I'm really kind of curious to see whether some of these new really exciting games that are coming out that have got real competitive potential. We talked about Rematch before we
got
came
Marvel
out.
Rivals as well.
Marvel Rivals,
using an insane IP.
All these incredible games that come out and show potential. Can they actually capture that audience and build a sort of sustained competitive scene? That's kind of what my eyes on. Hopefully that's the case, because I love the diversity of experiences that you can get in this sector.
I think what's really interesting is that, if you're in a normal sport World Cup or a normal sport competitive nature, the sport itself, it's like what I'm trying to get at is, like, there's going to be so many new things coming out, that there's going to be so many potential new things that need to be added to the Esports World Cup or the Esports Olympics or whatever. Like, it's very rare. I mean, obviously there are the odd thing here and there that gets added to the Olympics. Maybe, like golf got added a few years ago, I think. And I know that sometimes things drop off the calendar if they're not as, as popular. But in the main, the core kind of stuff doesn't change. Yeah. And even when the sport is added, like golf, for example, the golf's been around for, centuries, but it was only just added to the Olympics. Like, it's going to be super interesting on the esports side when new games come out, new games get added to the calendar, and then, like you say, these incumbents that maybe sat there thinking we're sitting pretty, take Call of Duty as an example, Call of Duty, there may be a time in 5 years' time when a new kind of game comes out, and actually they need to up their game, as it were. Do you know what I mean?
Competitive,
you can't rest on your laurels at all, can you? And go, well, I'm Call of Duty, therefore I'm always going to be around. It's very much a case of, like, I've always got to be innovating. I've always got to be making things interesting for people to play and for people to watch. And I think that's a really different thing if you compare that to traditional sports.
And it's a hard balance, right? Because you want the game to be accessible enough that your everyday Joe wants to log on and play it with their friends, and that's how kind of you get the viewership base and people talking about it interesting. But at the same time, there's got to be a sufficient kind of skill ramp so that people who really commit to it can hang around for years and years and years and kind of really push the envelope in terms of the skill levels at the real top end of play, right? So it's a really tricky balance to make. But I've already seen a few examples this year of games which are kind of starting to tease out those examples of reinventing a genre or trying to combine elements of two different really successful competitive formulas and blend it into an offering that really excite me, and hopefully they'll have the legs to keep going.
We'll see. Yeah.
Like, not every game is an esport as well. That's the main thing. I feel like a lot of people see that esports is booming and it's looking so good, and people try to force it into it, but a lot of times the games are just meant to be a game. And a lot of times people just like try to force something out of it, and I see it a lot, and it just fails instantly.
That's interesting.
1 month, if it doesn't work, then they just drop the whole thing. So it happens all the time.
And look, one big thing that was spoken about today has been prize money brand deals. So, a final question for the future for Joe, how do you see sort of regulation and tax requirements changing in this space?
I think I can't go through a podcast without talking about crypto. I think it is similar to what we've seen in crypto, right? Where, HMRC, the FCA, the SEC in the US, VAR in Dubai, so the regulator there. These people have had to adapt. They've had to change. They've had to come out with policies. They've had to, create policies. They've had to consult with industry experts to really get to how do we take this asset class and how do we bring it into the real world, if you like, so that the everyday person can use it. And I think a similar thing is going to end up happening in esports. And what I hope they don't do is what they tried to do, especially in the UK at the start of crypto, which is very much trying to kind of put it in the same bucket as other financial services, other financial asset classes. I hope that with esports, they don't try and just bracket it with other sports, and they do try and go, no, this is a category of its own, and it needs to be thought about on its own, and it needs to be, kind of like those rules and regulations need to be different. I think that's super important that they do that. So, yeah, I think changing regulation, changing tax rules, a lot of people are going to be, as we talked about, they are going to be traveling the world. They're not just going to be stuck in one jurisdiction. So really understanding that as time goes on, how we're going to manage multi-jurisdictional tax. We live in a super small world these days in terms of like how easy it is to get around. So people aren't staying in one location. They're not just living and working in the UK now. They're living and working all over. So I think that's going to be super important, is people understanding, if you think about it from, say 10 years ago, it was only your kind of high-flying corporate business people that would be multi-jurisdictional. Everyone else would have their job, they'd go to work in the country, and that's all changing. So I think that's something that, as the world gets smaller and, tax needs to play a part in that, we need to understand how people can be more efficient globally, whilst also making sure they stay compliant and stick to the rules that are there. But that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for savings and for efficiencies, and so we already have a lot of conversation with people that in the nice sense want to leave the UK and head to the Middle East. I'm sure that will increase with things like this as players start to see prize money ramping up and then their tax bills ramping up. I'm sure they'll say, well, actually, if my end goal is to be in Saudi at the World Cup, then maybe I want to base myself in Dubai or somewhere like that, and mix in that area. So I think that is the main thing we're going to see is a maturity of the space, and therefore a maturity of the kind of regulations and kind of tax and stuff that goes with it.
Indeed.
Honestly,
fantastic.
It's the biggest headache for my players, let me just tell you that. Like, the number one thing that no one knows about is exactly that, and there's no proper outline of what it is, because someone could live there, like people that live in Finland, but then they live in Berlin, but then they go compete in Singapore, they go compete in Toronto, and it's just like this whole thing. And then even the experts themselves, they don't know how to kind of approach it, because it's such a new aspect for them, especially with the esports thing.
But the challenge there as well is, unless you go to a Big Four, for example, most accounting firms or tax firms, they don't have expertise in all those jurisdictions. So it's not even just for our perspective, like we obviously work very closely, UK, UAE, we've got an office in South Africa. So like we work very closely in those jurisdictions, and we can support in other ones. But we still need experts on the ground to, and unless you go to a KPMG, for example, who have probably got offices in all those places, but they're super, super expensive.
Exactly.
And for your day-to-day, your day-to-day esports player, they can't afford to, but also they don't relate to a KPMG, for example, right? So it's similar to what we found in crypto. The reason we heavily focused on that area was that crypto people were able to relate to us. We I say played crypto, but trade. I don't want to use the word trade because I definitely don't trade, but like we were in the space, and similarly, a bit like I'm sure for you, Harry, and we mentioned earlier, you play, so you get it, right? You understand the market. So when people come and talk to you, you're talking on the same level, right? You're not talking as a lawyer, you're talking as someone that is in the same game, right? And you won't get that from KPMG. So then the challenge is, if they come to someone like us, how do we manage 5, 6, 7 different jurisdictions? So I think it's going to be something that needs to be developed from a framework as to how we manage all of that. And really a lot of these places need to come together. I guess the main solution is shift everything to Dubai.
Maybe, yeah, potentially. Just the hardest thing is those double treaties. Like no one knows anything about that. But we have seen actually some cases in esports where a couple people have actually got done for tax fraud because they were looking to. And so there's governments, especially in Europe, that actually are a bit more progressed than the kind of UK on that front. UK, I think, a couple of years they're going to start looking into it more, my guess. But yeah, in Europe we've seen some cases where people have been kind of done that before.
I mean, that's happened in traditional. There's a couple of big cases in Spain. It was some big Messi, Mourinho. I think even Ronaldo at one point. There must
Shakira as well in entertainment.
But there must have been a period where in Spain they treated the royalties and kind of brand deals in a slightly different way.
They have an interesting way there with their image kind of side of things in their contracts. Yeah,
because there's no way that all of those guys deliberately evaded tax. There must have been a particular way, and then the tax office have come along and gone, well, actually, this is what it should have been. This is how it should. But it's so difficult when you're managing all these different things. So I imagine we're going to get stuff like that in esports as well, where governments didn't really have an idea, so didn't give any clarity. Then when they started to give clarity, they went, oh, well, you should have done it like this in the first place. It was there. You should have read it. And so I think managing all of that is definitely going to be not so much getting people out of holes, that's the wrong phrase, but supporting them through rapidly changing legislation.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you all for coming today. This has been a great conversation, and hopefully the audience has enjoyed it as much as we have, filming it. But yeah, thank you, and look forward to watching the esports space continue to grow.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome.